Hello. Good afternoon. Please keep your mics off. Welcome. We are still waiting for all our other friends to join. We'll give it a minute or two before we start. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're just waiting another minute to let everybody in, and then we will start at 5 past. Thank you for your patience.
Sorry, before we start, I just want to say hello to High Commissioner Edgar. It's Meg from the Pacific.
It's very nice to see you, and hope all's well with you.
It's not easy at the moment.
No, I've been hearing the news, but I wish you all the best.
Thank you, and to you.
All right, so let's start with respect to everybody who has been on time. Is everyone able to hear me well? Any signs just to say you can hear me well? Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wonderful to see all those smiling faces and everybody taking their apero or afternoon drink with us or afternoon tea. Thank you for being here. Welcome, Nisa Bulavinaka. I'm Ashwini and Ashwini Prabha, and I'm the board chair for Pacific Island Climate Action Network. And I have this pleasure of being your moderator today. And I want to give a big shout out to all the speakers who have joined us today. There are like 5 of you. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us. And everybody, all the participants who are here, really warm, hearty thanks for being with us. This is very special for us because it's the launch of the Pacific demands for the whole region going into COP26, which starts in a week's time. And as you all know, there is an issue of representation from the Pacific Islands at this COP. And for this reason, it's really important that we speak loud, we make sure we are heard through all the other channels, even if some of our delegates and our CSOs don't make it to the COP itself due to COVID, at least they will be heard through the media, through all of you who are here, and through different organizations in the Pacific region who are going to speak out through various channels. And this is the start of it. This is the start of sharing those messages from the Pacific and not stepping back, even if our participation is hindered in the COP event. So today, what we are going to do is launch the specific demands, but I just wanted to give you a little small story before we go into it. You know how in the Pacific we love storytelling. So I thought I would just tell you where PICAN and all the other climate action network. So when I say CAN is Climate Action Network, and this is actually part of a very huge body of CSOs from all over the world. We are part of 1,100 NGOs in different parts of the world, and coming from grassroots NGOs to some very big names and big global bingos. So it's everybody is there in that space, and it's quite a strong constituency that is lobbying and doing advocacy at COP level since almost 20 years now, actually. And it's a important thing to know that in the Pacific, the first Climate Action Network was started in Tuvalu. So our colleagues in Tuvalu here, hats off to you for getting together about 2007 through somebody who's a Cook Islander, actually, Diane McFadden, who used to work for WWF in those days. So that's storytelling. She used to go to Tuvalu when nobody used to actually do climate change work there in the very beginning of those 2004 to 7, and they created the Climate Action Network together. And then after that came around Kiribati, PICAN, so Kiribati Climate Action Network, which is about 11 years old. And after that was Vanuatu Climate Action Network. And at the same time, around 2013, Vanuatu and the Pacific Regional Network came out. So the PICAN, which you see in the invitation, it's Pacific Island Climate Action Network. And that's actually bringing together and uniting all the different nodes at country level and trying to do regional amplification of country topics and issues. And that's the regional secretariat, which is serving the country offices and vice versa, sort of, and taking the voices of the countries to all the regional forums and also international forum. And then we also have a node in Solomon Islands. Let me not forget to acknowledge you. So good afternoon, those who are joining us from Solomon Islands. And Fiji is still to have a node, but that doesn't matter. All those fantastic CSOs in Fiji have been really aligning behind the Pacific Can and sort of working very, very closely. So it's this solidarity that's coming out through CSOs that's really making us feel stronger and stronger as we communicate and go forward talking about climate change since the past 20 years or so. So with that, I want to acknowledge some people who are not in this room, but who are actually with us in spirit. So I want to acknowledge the elders and the ancestors of the Pacific Islands who are always with us and who are actually blessing the work that the Pacific Islanders are doing, whether it's on environment or economics or whatever fora we are engaging on. We are quite blessed by these elders and ancestors that hold us together, but also the elders who have actually engaged on climate change issues since a long time. And we just want to acknowledge you and say thank you. And thank you for also educating the younger generation and those who came after you on the issue, because now the topic has gone so much in the hands of the generation to come. But I must admit that this whole debate and the acknowledgement of the issue of climate change started with the elders who started working in this field in the Pacific region. So humble gratitude to them. And I also want to say we have our sign language interpreters here, and that's Lorraine and Macareta. Vinaka, both of you, for being here and for helping us out today with this launch. And I wanted to acknowledge that now we're going to pass over to Maima Vai, who's going to give us some beautiful blessings to start the event. Maima, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Noble Kalo, my Lord, we thank you for the gift of life. We thank and praise you for the mystery of creation. We know that you are in us and we in you. You have blessed our sisters and brothers in the Pacific with the Vanua, Whenua, and the Wasawasa, Waitutui, Moana, which are bountiful and marked by great beauty. Remind us to live in peace and harmony with all of creation. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Call us to renewal, to stewardship. Call us to solidarity with the earth and all its creatures. Give us new vision to see the fragile beauty that remains to us. Give us new spiritual energy to become active in loving the world through our daily lives. Give us new voices to speak out for the environmental solidarity. Bless us again with the gift of being a joyful community. Bless us with the love of your creation. Help us to listen to your voice, your word, and your creation. Amen.
Vinaka Imaima, thank you very much for that. And with that, I would like to take us into the official program, which is the launch of the Pacific Island demands. And I would like to highlight that there's actually 7 key things that we want to flag today, and we want to acknowledge the contribution of all the civil society organizations who are attending the event, and maybe some of them haven't attended today, but they have been actively part of these demands, and you can find them on the website. We will post the link, but also just on a very quick highlight, these demands are ranging from something very simple and very crucial, and the root cause of climate change, which is talking about fossil fuel phase out and keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and then going into something that's very much like stop giving money and subsidies to fossil fuel industry, but divert that to loss and damage and ensure that the loss and damage fund is not empty. So this is the demands in the Pacific range from one spectrum to the other, and they cover all these issues together with human rights, gender rights, and also talking about NDCs and how countries should actually be ambitious with their NDCs if they really are serious about 1.5, because what we see right now is not enough energy and ambition from the countries that's required for the survival of the Pacific Islands. And I'm sure our first speaker will have much more insight, because he's been actually working, he's been envoy of climate security in Africa as well. So Honorable George Edgar, I welcome you to the panel, and he is the British High Commissioner to the Republic of Fiji, and he joined in 2020. And he was actually a European Union ambassador in Cambodia as well. And he has been involved in the 2012 Olympics and also on the issue of climate change and security. So over to you, Honorable Edgar.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Bulavinaka. And thank you very much for inviting me to join this meeting to launch the Pacific COP26 demands. I'd like to start by offering my good wishes and thanks to the organizations that make up the Pacific Island Climate Action Network for all the important work they do in advocacy and in practical action. We are now little more than a week away from COP26 in Glasgow. The UK, as presidency of COP26, is very conscious of the significance of this meeting. The urgency of the climate crisis is being brought home all the time by the extent of extreme weather events across the world, cyclones and floods, droughts and wildfires. And some of those are sadly very familiar to everyone in the Pacific. And it's not just a question of big dramatic events, but also of creeping change in the ability of natural systems to cope with the changing climate. And the most recent IPCC report, as we all know, has only underlined how much we have to do and how little time we have to do it. COP26 should have been a status check and a review 5 years, now 6 years on from COP21 in Paris, and a tying up of loose ends from the Paris Agreement. But the urgency of the climate crisis means that in practice, it's a lot more than that. We have undoubtedly made progress since COP21 and even over the last months. Around 70% of the world's economy is now covered by net zero targets, up from less than 30% when the UK took on the presidency of COP26. And under the UK's G7 presidency, all countries which attended the G7 summit committed to ambitious emissions reduction targets in the 2020s and agreed to cease international funding for coal power this year. At the UN General Assembly in September, there were a number of important announcements, including the US decision to double its climate finance to $11.4 billion a year, and the Chinese announcement that it will stop funding coal-fired power projects overseas. And since then, there have been further positive moves, including Russia's announcement of a net zero target for 2060 and New Zealand's announcement of significantly increased climate finance. But we still have a very long way to go, particularly in terms of the emissions cuts that are needed between now and 2030. According to recent figures, the current international commitments will result in global greenhouse gas emissions rising by 16% by 2030, when we need them to fall by around 50% to have any chance of staying within a 1.5 degree limit. So we look to the high emitting countries, especially the G20, who will be holding their summit in Rome on the eve of COP26, to step up to the mark, and to all those countries that have not submitted ambitious enhanced NDCs to do so. One important aspect, as I've mentioned, and which is highlighted in the Pacific demands, is the urgent need to phase out power plants running on coal as the most polluting of the fossil fuels. A growing number of countries have committed to ending overseas investment in coal, but we need to see an end to domestic investment as well, and plans for the rapid phase out of existing coal-fired plants. It's clear too that over the coming years, we will need to go further and phase out fossil fuel use altogether. Finance is another huge issue. We look to the big developed economies to ensure that the commitment of $100 billion per year in climate finance is met, and that plans are in place for an increase of that figure beyond 2025. The UK is doing its part and has doubled its climate finance commitment for the current 5-year period. Looking more generally, we have 4 priority areas for COP26: to secure global net zero and keep 1.5 degrees within reach, to urgently adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, to mobilize finance, and to work together to accelerate action. And we want to be sure that as we do that, the needs and priorities of the vulnerable countries, not least those in the Pacific, are fully reflected. I'm sorry that the impact of COVID-19 on travel and their own quarantine requirements mean that a number of the Pacific countries will not have delegations from their capitals at COP26. I hope that those who are there will raise Pacific priorities loud and clear, and will work in the corridors to encourage greater ambition on the part of those countries that are lagging behind. And I welcome the decision to appoint Pacific champions who can represent the region as a whole on some of the vital issues. I want to note the important statement that was issued by Pacific leaders a little over 2 weeks ago on the 6th of October. That statement calls for decisive commitments on climate action, and that is exactly what is needed. There is a vital role for civil society too, in advocacy for stronger and faster action, as exemplified by the very powerful document which is being launched today in the shape of the Pacific Climate Demands, but also in working at national or community level to support adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and in education, the impacts of climate change and the imperatives for action. Action not just at international level or at state level, but at community level and at individual level. We don't, as a world, lack the technology or the resources to achieve the changes that are required to meet the challenge of climate change. What we have lacked so far is sufficient political will. The twin challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss are the biggest issues facing humanity. Addressing them means changing how we think, how we act, and how we measure success. It means transforming our institutions and systems, in particular our finance and education systems, to make these changes possible and to sustain them for future generations. I'm glad to join with you in launching the Pacific Climate Demands today. I wish you success in your efforts on behalf of the peoples of the Pacific, and success for all of us in making COP26 the turning point that it needs to be. Thank you for your attention.
His Excellency, Mr. Edgar. And just touching on what he has highlighted is adaptation at community and individual level. And I think that's something that the Pacific Islanders are actually very familiar with and have been doing for a number of years, because we can't say climate change will affect us, because it's been affecting us for quite a few years already. And one thing in terms of phase out, you had mentioned coal, and I would also like to acknowledge that in our backyard, we have our Australian government who has an addiction to coal. And then let's not forget that coal is not the only problem anymore. Oil and gas is another problem too, because fellow countries like United States and Canada are actually planning to expand their oil and gas production. And that's also fossil fuel. There seems to be some kind of disconnect when it comes to governments arguing for development on fossil fuel. They say, okay, we won't do coal, but let's just develop gas for now. But gas and oil are all fossil fuel. So Pacific demands are actually saying all of these need to phase out, and we need to go to renewables faster. And with that, I'd like to welcome one of my favorite elders, and that's Honorable Anote Tong, who's here with us. And would you please bring him forward? And he is one of those forefathers in the climate negotiations, I like to say. And he's not a stranger to anyone here, I believe. And he's been the former president for Kiribati for 3 terms between 2003 and 2016. But what he had done during that time has been amazingly symbolic in the climate community, because he really brought the attention to the issue of human rights, the human dimension of climate change during his time in office, and also highlighted how we risk losing entire islands, entire countries, and there's so much more at risk in the Pacific, which rest of the world didn't know in the beginning or didn't acknowledge. But Honorable Anote Tong is somebody who actually brought that to the limelight and said, hey, wake up. That's the issue in the Pacific. And he's actually a distinguished fellow at Conservation International, and also has been nominated for a number of Nobel Peace Prizes and other peace prizes as well. So please, sir, enlighten us with today what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Ashwini, for that introduction. And let me begin with a word of greeting. In Kiribati, we always bless each other. So let me bless you. Kamdanau, meaning may you be blessed. Okay, and of course, I take this opportunity to thank PICAN, Greenpeace, and all of those of you people who continue to be active in this area. There is never enough that needs to be said about this. And I want to thank the High Commissioner, His Excellency, he's the High Commissioner from the United Kingdom to Fiji. I relate very well to the points that you've made. And I won't repeat the comments that have already been made, and which I also believe that other speakers will make. But what I want to say is perhaps reflect back on what experience that I've had over almost 20 years now that I've been involved with this, and try to get some inspiration for what might happen in Glasgow. And I remember the beginning, the early stages, when somebody like me stood alone and spoke at the United Nations General Assembly about something nebulous like climate change. Nobody believed me, nobody listened to me. And it's so gratifying that now the narrative is different. We are getting a lot more momentum behind the campaign, and especially involving the young people, which is particularly welcome. But and so there was a lot of work. I remember that, a lot of work pushing to get things done because of the dismal failure we had in Copenhagen in 2009. And so there was a lot more work building up to Paris. So in Paris, what we did was something wonderful. We had a piece of paper which we all signed to, okay? But it has remained a piece of paper until now. And this is the point that I think needs to be made, because until we can put into action those commitments, they remain meaningless. And unless we can respond to what is demanded in order for us to be able to, for our demands to be met. I've gone through the demands, and what do we demand? We simply demand that we survive this challenge. We simply demand that our young people must have a future. We simply demand that we must be given justice, that we must be given some kind of compensation. Somebody has to take responsibility for what is happening. Because there was also a time when I used to speak as a country, as somebody, a leader from a country that is on the front line of climate change, whose future was at stake. Now the narrative is changed, because even big countries, we are seeing events in other parts of the world, which now makes those countries, which maybe 10, 15 years ago did not see any relevance of the discussions on climate change to their future. Now saying that, talking about the civilization, the extinction of civilization. I remember my talks in Australia when I spoke in 2018, and I said, oh, I don't know what will happen next summer, but you may get your bushfires. And of course, they got the bushfires. And so in spite of all of that, in spite of all the science, we continue not to respond as in the way that we need. As the High Commissioner said, we are running out of time. And really the question is, will we make it in time? I think what I've always acknowledged, and I think what we must also acknowledge, that for most of us in the Pacific, our days are already numbered, because whatever happens, even if we cut emissions to zero tomorrow, the momentum of what's already in the atmosphere will ensure that we continue to suffer, and our future cannot be assured. And so, let alone trying to cut emissions, let alone trying to maintain global temperatures below 2 degrees and not much above 1.5. But the reality is, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be hurt. The question is the world, is the international community, is the global community ready for this? I don't believe so, because we really haven't discussed it. We're still talking about cutting emissions. We haven't talked about those people who will be displaced in any serious manner. But those are the realities which most of us in the Pacific Island countries will face. That is the reality. The science is very clear. And so this is what I really hope that we can, this is the kind of message that I really hope we can convey in Glasgow, because otherwise it would not have been of much meaning to us. And so the challenge, and I think this is something that's been going on year after year, is how serious are we? Do we really believe that climate change is real? I don't think our actions reflect that acknowledgement of that reality. And so this is, until we can do that, I'm afraid it's going to remain difficult. We continue to ask our leaders to put more effort into it. Yet, I think High Commissioner, you've just mentioned that, no, sorry, Ashwini, he just said that a number of countries continue to do what we've asked them not to do. In 2012, we called for a moratorium, on the opening of new coal mines. Okay, that didn't happen, and it's not happening. Now, what we need to happen is the existing coal mines must not carry on mining, but must leave the coal in the ground. And so there's got to be some very serious reckoning in Glasgow, a serious reflection on what it is that we as individual nations, as leaders, hope to achieve and to deliver, not just for our people, but for the people of this planet. And so that is the challenge, and that is the demand. I know I'm running out of time, but I could talk for hours, but thank you for this opportunity. And of course, we can interact at the end of the, towards the end of the session. Thank you. Let me end there. Take it out.
Pinaka for those words, and very wise and very timely reminders on each topic, and especially the fact that climate change is in everybody's backyard now. It's not about just the islands or the global south, it's everybody's issue, and thank you for reminding us of that. And I will go on to our second speaker, who I have a real pleasure of seeing finally, because we've been exchanging over the years via email. So, Madam Emeline Siale Ilolahia, welcome and thank you for being with us. I'm really honored that you have decided to join us on this panel. And she is the Executive Director of PIANGO, the Pacific Island Association of NGOs. She's a Tongan national who has been there in the civil society space for a very long time, and initially working with the CSOs in Tonga, but since 2018, she is working with PIANGO as the regional director. And she has a great track record in sustainability and also how to work in partnership in the region. And I'd like her to share her views now on the Pacific demands going into COP and what her views are, how the CSOs should cooperate. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Pulavinaka, everyone. Malo elelei. It's a great pleasure to join the conversation this evening, and I don't want to repeat what my fellow speakers have had mentioned earlier. What I'll do, I'll just pick a few points from the Pacific demand that we are launching today. But before that, I think the 1.5 demand is quite obvious. That has been our key demand from the Pacific, and that has been very quite clear. We are also, as we have heard the previous speakers relating to fossil fuel, that message is quite clear. What I also quite happy that it's been included is the role of youth. Gender and inclusivity is part of the demand. You know, like we are looking into the right of nature is something that is coming out strongly, and I think that's something that I would like to acknowledge. That is inspiring to bring that, because from PIANGO perspective, we believe that that we need to start looking at climate change from a development human right lens, because it's no longer a negotiations for something that held for the future. It's something that is really right here, right now, and we have seen loss of lives. We have seen loss of property. We have seen claim of the sea level rising, claiming our land. We have seen displaced community because they have to relocate themselves because of the impact of the climate change. And so all of that has really highlighted the injustices that are embedded in how we live our life when our communal livelihood and well-being is based on our nature resources, on our land, our forest, our agriculture system, our food system, are all being disrupted by the climate crisis. And so when we start to talk about climate change from a human right perspective, that we start to hear see the change in the narrative for a climate justice, which is a demand for a right to life, because it's no longer something that we said maybe here, maybe there, but it's here, and it's already claiming a lot of the things that we had being the basis of our resilience, our indigenous knowledge that are put to the test when it comes to demand for a better adaptation of our system that are being disrupted by the climate impact. So I would like to highlight that, which I am quite happy to see that is being part and parcel of our demand from the Pacific. We had loved to contribute to the Pacific demand by trying to bring into the conversation the acknowledging the link between the climate actions and the self-determination struggles. Yeah, because we still want to see that we're talking about the climate justice, but we want also to make sure that that we don't leave anyone behind in our Pacific region, in our Pacific with our Pacific people. And when we are talking about leaving no one behind, we are also looking at our community that are still under the influence of foreign rule. Like we have been always talking about the human rights abuse that are happening in West Papua. The challenges that are happening in Kanaki, New Caledonia, in Mahunui in French Polynesia. Those are kind of elephant in the room when we are talking about these things, but I think that when we are talking about climate change, it's become the core of everything that we do in the region in relations to our human life. And so we cannot leave anything out without bringing that to the context of when we talk about climate change. It's a human issue. It's a human core of that is the people. And so we need to bring everything that we would like to see that is being safeguarded. Our people, that means that we have to include those that are depending on the land, but they are also, we have seen those opportunities that they can access to make a better life is no longer in their choices to make. Yeah, it's made by other people. So those are the things that are kind of maybe difficult to digest at times. But if we are saying that this is going to be an ongoing conversation, that we need to highlight those issues at the global platform, I'm happy to see that it's starting now, that we are start bringing this together to present it to the world and said, we are not just talking about fossil fuel, we are trying to talk about the whole entirely of our Pacific in terms of where do we see our people place themselves and how they're related to their nature and how they're related to their environment, how they're related to their biodiversity. And when those issues are not being, in a state where it can, build their integrity of their people. And I think this is the other point that I would like to make. I would like that I have seen and appreciate how we are bringing the ocean into the conversation around climate change. And because I'm with due respect and appreciations of having the former SG of PIFs, she has been one of the key lady that has taken the conversation about our blue Pacific and our ocean forward in many ways, and it's about time that we bring that to the conversation, that our ocean is our the largest carbon sink, but at the same time is a public goods for us in our region, our life, our culture, everything that's associated with that. But also at the same time, when we need to talk about loss and damages, bring the humanitarian component, disaster related, to be part of that conversation, because it's crucial that we have to make sure that the loss and damages is not just related to how we see at the global level of the negotiation, but its impact and its evidence, the losses in the life, the losses of properties associated with that need to be part of that. Adaptation is key, and I'm quite happy that it's really part of this, because livelihood of our people is really the way forward, and for the adaptation to continue to hold our land, hold our Pacific Islands, our community together, so that we leave something that is far better than where we find it, for the betterment of our young people. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Siale. That's really fantastic how you have planted the root of the human rights issue into climate change. And that's exactly where we are going as Pacific CSOs as well, because this year has been all about climate justice and human rights and how that should be ingrained into the UNFCCC process even, and in the whole climate debate. And some countries would like to see that not happen. And thank you that you have precisely pointed out that that is the need of the hour now, because this is a human issue. And thank you for also bringing the limelight on our next speaker, who has been the Pacific Ocean Commissioner as well. And that's, please bring her forward now. And I would like to welcome Madam Dame Meg Taylor. And she is definitely not needing too much introduction. I'm sure people know her already, but for those who haven't met her before, she is from Papua New Guinea and she's a lawyer and diplomat. She has been a diplomat, and she was the former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and she finished her term recently. She has been there since 2014, and she has been also raising the flag about the oceans in the past years. So with that, I'd like Madam Taylor to please take the floor and tell us a little bit about the resilience aspect for the Pacific Islands, and also touching on some of the finance issues, climate finance issues.
Thank you very
Over to
much. Thank you very much, Ashwini. And let me first acknowledge His Excellency, High Commissioner Edgar, and of course, His Excellency Anote Tong. And to see many good and old friends. And I greet you all. Me, hamamas through look at you, na abinon through Kamlo, Papua New Guinea. I'm going to focus on climate finance. I'm not a specialist in this area, but I think it's a key component of the conversations that we're going to have. And as High Commissioner Edgar said earlier, that we need a decisive COP, but we need a decisive COP in terms of the commitments on climate financing, so we know exactly where we stand as SIDS, and most importantly for us as Pacific SIDS. So in 2009, the developed countries did commit to mobilizing jointly $100 billion a year to address the climate issues. And then again, this was reaffirmed at the Paris Agreement in 2015 under Article 9. But what do we as Pacific people want from COP in terms of the climate finance issues? What we do want to see is that the developed countries deliver on that 100 billion commitment per year. And we also want to know where those funds go and how they are used. And I think that's been some concern for many countries over a period of time. So we need greater transparency in the methodology on how to track the money that comes, once it comes in, to be dispersed through the developing world and to the developed world in terms of the technology that they want to invest in as well. I think we're going to need new commitments or decisions to increase the proportion of climate finance towards adaptation. And if you look at the moment, currently only 21% of the total public finance is allocated for adaptation. And from that, only 5% is from bilateral sources. Annual coastal adaptation needs for the Pacific is between US dollars 234 and US dollars 796 million. And globally, the need is around 70 US, US 70 billion. I think in the Pacific, we have to keep reminding people about the vulnerability of the region. And that means we have to emphasize that we're going to need these resources because of what we live with. I understand that around 220 million per year, or 2.2 billion in the past 10 years, flow to the Pacific SIDS. And this equates to just around 0.28% of the 79.6 billion mobilized globally in 2019. But in 2020, the economic losses that our country suffered, And this was from climate-induced disasters. It was close to around $1 billion US. And between 2015 and the category 5 cyclones that wreaked havoc through the region, our damages were from 31 to 63% of the GDP of all our countries. So that's a big impact that we have in the region, and that's why we need this assistance. Over the years, it's been really apparent that a lot of money goes to mitigation. And I'm pleased to say that the United Kingdom, as chair of COP26, has been very proactive in terms of the bilateral, in terms of the funds going and committed to adaptation. And we need that very, very importantly. I just want to touch on the fact, the issue around once this funding from climate finance gets into the institutions like Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, we just need to know that they make themselves much more accessible, that they simplify their reporting templates, they provide resourceful capacity support for our countries so that we can access the funds, but also in terms of reporting back instead of crowding them. Holding on to these funds so tightly. I want to make a plug here for the Pacific Resilience Facility that was supported by the leaders in Tuvalu. It has not been launched yet by the Secretary General of the UN. This was a fund very much focused on small-scale adaptation projects of a value of about 5 billion, which is 1% of the GDP of the Pacific over a period of 5 years. And 5 billion is not a lot of money for what we need in the region. And to help our communities do their own projects in adaptation. And there's enough capacity within our island countries, but there's also capacity in our neighboring countries in Australia, New Zealand, and in Southeast Asia that would also come to help us to make sure that we get what we need in terms of preparing ourselves for the life ahead. I think that there is room after the COP26 for institutions to exist in the Pacific region so that we look after ourselves. I want to touch on the fact, just two more issues, and that is that we must focus on post-2025 and what that climate finance will be used for and the amounts that we need. We also need to ensure that the funding that comes from developing countries, and particularly in private capital, to see if we can get funds that come in forms of grant other than loans. The multilateral development agencies will be looking for concessional financing, and yes, there will be some that will there will be grants, but private capital can also look at where grants can come into the SIDS and into Pacific SIDS as we, particularly post 2025, so that we meet the targets that we need to meet in terms of our own survival. Finally, I just wanted to reinforce Siale's comments about loss and damage. And here we need a dedicated financing mechanism. It's not just something that we talk about, and I think it'll be a tough negotiation. I don't think there's a commitment to that totally from the heart. And the Pacific will put up a good fight with regards to what we need for the future. Just while I have the floor, I understand the sentiments in terms of the transition of economies from fossil fuel to carbon neutral. My own country will face that challenge itself. And in the Paris Agreement, it's very clear that in terms of transition, that in terms of the economic development is very much a part of the climate transition. And countries are going to have to make those tough decisions themselves. And there will be windows where countries will develop their gas so that they are able to support their countries, and hopefully by 2050 are carbon neutral. So those challenges are in the Western Pacific and to our neighbors in Southeast Asia. And it's interesting, since I've come back to this part of the world in the Western Pacific, those issues are very much at the forefront here in Papua New Guinea and other places. I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to contribute.
Madam Taylor, and those were some very amazing points, especially coming from experience of Papua New Guinea as well. That's very good to hear. And I just want to let people know that I'm very aware we're running late with time, and the speakers are so excellent. They have so many good knowledge and wisdom, and also the knowledge of climate change to share with us, that we are going over time. And I still have 3 more speakers to go, but I just humbly request your patience, and please stay with us. And the fact that we can have a bit of a chilled Pacific time attitude rather than trying to rush through this program. I'd be very honored that if you all just be patient and stay with us together. And I want to acknowledge that we also have Honorable Bikenibeu, former Tuvalu Prime Minister with us, who's joined us now. And we have Raijeli Nicola from OXFAM. And the next speaker is Dr. Nicola Casule, Head of Research and Investigations at Greenpeace Australia Pacific. And he is going to talk to us about Article 6 and a bit more on the Pacific Climate Report. So without further delay, Dr. Casule, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for being here. It's always both a blessing and a curse to come late in the speaking list in these events. A blessing because I get to hear what my learned colleagues have been able to say, and so I try to avoid repeating what they've said, but also a curse because often inevitably we are running short on time, and so I feel responsible to try and be really on time, so I hope I'll be able to do that. I'm calling in from what is now called Sydney, Australia, but what was and always will be the land of the Gadigal Indigenous traditional owners. And I'd like to begin by paying my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to speak briefly from my undoubtedly privileged vantage point about what developed countries like Australia have to do at Glasgow to be seen as credible in the eyes of the world, based on what the latest climate science tells us. But first, a couple of points of fact that bear repeating, I think. It shames me to say that Australia is currently a best practice example of how to behave in bad faith on climate action. Australia is one of the biggest per capita emitters in the world and one of the biggest exporters of coal and gas. It is also one of the least ambitious nations when it comes to our nationally determined contribution. Climate Action Tracker's latest assessment dropped Australia's target ranking from its insufficient to highly insufficient category, meaning that if all nations around the world adopted a comparable level of ambition, the world would warm between 3 and 4 degrees by 2100. Australia is one prominent example of a global trend of climate injustice. As Greenpeace Australia Pacific's recent report, Te Mana o Te Moana, the State of the Climate in the Pacific 2021 showed, the top 15 biggest climate emitting nations were responsible for 72% of all annual emissions in 2020. But the 14 Pacific Island countries in the Paris Agreement were responsible for just 0.23%. We know from the IPCC's excellent work that heating of 1.5 degrees is already too high, and that 2 degrees will be even more catastrophic for the Pacific, with loss of lives and livelihoods, more intense cyclones, worse sea level rises, and an almost complete die-off of coral reefs in the region and indeed around the world. In this context, high ambition on climate action by those responsible for it is critical. And this is why yesterday's explosive whistleblower revelations by Greenpeace's Unearthed Investigations Unit in the UK are so important. For those of you that haven't seen the reporting on that sort of yesterday and today, Unearthed was allowed to cite a leaked copy of the upcoming IPCC AR6 report from the Working Group 3, focused on climate solutions, including all of the suggested track changes and edits by major emitting nations. And what that work revealed was that Australia sought to water down that report, which is supposed to be based purely on the science, removing references to the need to phase out coal as a key step for climate action, tried to criticize to remove the criticism rather of the role played by fossil fuel lobbyists in hampering climate action. And almost incredibly, Australia was trying to be removed from a list of top fossil fuel producing nations, despite being it being without dispute, despite it being a fact that the world's largest coal exporter is Australia, and that Australia is the second largest gas exporter in the world. So what we have here is not simply a nation failing to do the right thing by the world on climate change, although that is true, but actually going beyond that and actively trying to reduce the impetus for action everywhere through pressure to distort science to please the fossil fuel industry that is responsible ultimately for the crisis that we are all in. It's the worst kind of two-facedness from Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who claims that Australia, often claims in fact, and too many of those on this call has done so, claims that Australia is part of a Pacific family. But if that is indeed true, if we accept Mr. Morrison's metaphor, his government's actions are more akin to that of perhaps an abusive uncle than a benevolent relative. It's beyond time for countries like Australia to adopt strong science-based cuts to greenhouse gas emissions that are commensurate with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. As the IPCC's recent report shows, we can still hit, or rather, we can still limit warming to below 1.5 degrees, and that is something that we cannot give up on. What this means is going to Glasgow, and Mr. Morrison finally decided to go, having been sort of pressured into it by the outcry around the world and in Australia for his flagging of a decision not to go. But it means going to Glasgow as a developed country with substantial responsibility for creating the climate crisis. And while there, proposing an NDC which entirely phases out coal-fired electricity by 2030 and hits net zero emissions from Australia's economy as a whole, not by 2050, but as recommended by many pieces of research and bodies around the world, by 2035. And this is the last thing I'll say, perhaps most important of all, when it comes to the position of the Pacific in global climate negotiations, it means not saying something about us in the bright sunlight of the public square, but then going and doing the opposite in the airless conference rooms where the hopes of the world are too often politely strangled. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Casule. And it's a good reminder on actually some of the perspectives that you've brought in, and that we have to keep linking what's happening on the ground to what's happening at UNFCCC level as well, and how the governments are negotiating. And with that, I'll bring in our next speaker, who is Raijeli Nicola, and she is joining us from OXFAM, so from Fiji actually, and she's the regional director for OXFAM and has been involved in the organization's program advocacy and humanitarian work in the Pacific. She used to work for the Save the Children Fund, so for those who know her from before, and she was also working in the Internal Affairs Department in New Zealand. So she has quite a big encompassing understanding of the negotiations issues, but also the humanitarian crisis that involves the climate sector. And Raijeli, please tell us a little bit more about your perspective and also some of the finance issues that OXFAM has been highlighting so far.
Naka, thank you, Ashwini. Lovely to be here. Thank you again for the invitation to provide one perspective in terms of critical demands to bring to the table. But before I go any further, just want to acknowledge Your Excellencies, the UK High Commissioner, George Edgar, Anote Tong, and the Honourable Bikenibeu Emeline. Lovely to see you again, Dame Meg Taylor, and then of course to my colleagues from the civil society space. Lovely to share this space with you, Siale, Nicholas, and good evening to all of those of you who've joined us tonight. My intervention this evening is on climate finance, But in particular, what I want to hone in on, and also just to contextualize this, Nicola has spoken, and he works at Greenpeace, and I work for OXFAM. We are two international organizations that are located here in the Pacific and very much committed to ensuring that Pacific perspectives, narrative, that the paradigms in terms of what informs what we bring to the table is not lost at those global conversations. So it's really about how how we leverage our international privilege, we can call that, and power. We have, through working with our other OXFAMs or Greenpeaces in the system, we have the ability to pressure our governments. And I want to start by recognizing the power that people bring to shifting the dial. For us, we keep saying, this is the last opportunity, COP. This is the last chance to get it right. And I want us to start with what happened in France, the ruling that came out last week, where it was a joint action between two internationals, Greenpeace and OXFAM, working with national NGOs, and then together with people power, 2.3 million French citizens signed a petition to hold the French government to account about the way in which that it wasn't upholding its commitments. Last week, the Paris Administration Tribunal gave a ruling. So, sorry, let me pull back. So in February, the tribunal, the court had already ruled that the government must respect its commitment to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 compared to 1990. So last week, what they put out, what the Paris Administrative Tribunal ruling ordered, is that the French government needed to take all necessary measures to repair ecological damage and to prevent further increase of carbon emissions by the end of December 2020. Now, that shifts the way in which we as civil society, those of us who work in institutions in terms of holding our governments to account, holding the different stakeholders to account, because now that informs the kind of propositions that we bring forward. So I want us to start at this level, because if we're talking about this is the last opportunity, COP, the last chance, then the key message I want to look at now is that let's look at what countries are doing. What are they going to do? Not what they say, not what they just commit. There's a difference here. What do they do? And the best way to look at what they do is to look at past behavior. And this is where I want to connect with what Dame Meg had talked about when we looked at climate finance. 2 points that I want to raise, go into what she had talked about. Most of the money that has flowed out, and for us as an organization, what we do well as OXFAM is to provide evidence in terms of what's the track record. And with the, so we put out, I've got blurred, sorry, let me take out the blurred background so you can actually see what I'm holding up. Yeah. So, this is the climate finance report for 2018. We've also put up in 2017, but this is the one that we put up last year. And what is quite clear from the report we put up last year is that we've got serious concerns about how, in terms of the tracking to 100 billion, 59.5 billion per year was given in 2017, 2018, but as Dame Meg had showed, the majority of that were loans. There's 80% of that 59.5 billion are loans. So actually, when you look at the real true value of what comes, in terms of climate finance, it sits around 19 billion, right? Dame Meg also spoke about, and I'll connect later to the loss and damage piece. Now, so in terms of COP26, we've got to be sharper in terms of our demand, to add to what is being put forward by the PICAN action together with its networks is around what's our ask, What needs to change? What are the key areas that we now start to track? So what we want to see is robust common accounting standards and a specific finance goal for adaptation. What Dame Meg had said is that of the resources of the finance money that's put out, only 25% goes to adaptation. The majority goes to mitigation. And then of that 25%, the Pacific receives between 2 to 5% of that resource. Yeah. So anyway, in terms of our what we have to keep our eyes on, because this is the thing, is don't just look at the money amount, look at the accounting standards that are being put out. So we want, coming out of COP26, for parties to agree on new rules, new accounting standards, which ensures, so for instance, a new accounting standards for, in terms of MDBs, multilateral development banks, private sector lending arms, or multilateral climate funds. And what we need to track quite clearly is to look at the full, when money comes down, look at the full project list. Then what we want to see is a reporting of the full project list, report the grant equivalent of their climate finance that is being done. What we want to be able to also track and to, when there's climate change is part of a broader development project, what we want to see is exactly tell us how much of those resources, am I still in the call? Yes, I am.
Yes, we hear you. Please continue.
Yes, okay. Sorry, there's been a change on my screen. So, so what I'm saying here is that when there's reporting that's done on a broader development project that says, look, this project contributes to climate change, we want to know exactly how much. So what I'm getting at here is that we need to be tracking, and this takes me to the next point around what are we asking for. We're not just asking for increased commitment in climate finance, we're saying no loans, more grants, but then in terms of the reporting piece, yeah? And in this area, we've got to look at how these resources are governed. Who is making the decision? Recently, we've been looking at, is climate finance coming into the Pacific? Is it effective? And when we ask the questions of effectiveness, it's not just excess and how much flows in. It's about who is making those decisions for whom. Now, we put out a report last year, which was making climate finance work for women. And this was a study that was done in Polynesia and in the Micronesian countries. And what we can tell you is that women are not aware of these climate finances that are coming. And this is the kind of granularity information that we are needing to see. So sorry, I won't go in, just 2 more points, Ashwini. So not only the tracking of finance, then they need to be, projects that are coming in where resources are going to. When you look at the governance of finance, who is making decision, where is the money going? That's when you start to make the connection. Is this resource going to locally led and owned projects and programming? Is this resource going to women in terms of them addressing their needs, addressing their realities? Is, what we're wanting to see is that social accountability of this resource. So that whole money flowing in, when we say grants, not loans, there's a further steps that we need to look at. Now I want to make, I want to finish looking at financing for loss and damage. And that the key item that we want to get out of COP26 is to ensure that financing for loss and damage is a standalone permanent agenda at the UNFCCC. That's one. And that as yet, we don't have developed countries that haven't made their commitments on LND. It is not, loss and damage is not the funding for humanitarian systems. It is not on insurance. It is not adaptation finance. And this is where the arguments around loss and damage we need to bring in the interconnections that Siale had talked about around addressing human rights. It's not just safeguarding, we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about people. And to have that conversation, it is about looking, at certain meetings where people have talked about it's a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift that we are needing from developed countries, it actually starts with us having to question. When I say us, I'm speaking about me working for an international NGO. It starts with the question, with us having to question our privileges and our power. That's where it starts. That's where the paradigm shift has to start. So to talk loss and damage, paradigm shift starts with us having to look at what is it that we're willing to give up and being clear about that. Naka.
Vinaka Raijeli. And I must say, thanks for highlighting those two reports, and also the fact that funding shouldn't be low. And actually, end of the day, we should also hold polluters accountable for paying some of this stuff, right? And not the islands. With that, I just want to acknowledge all the people who are still with us. Thank you so very much for hanging in there. I know we've run late. We will end at 12:30, so we have 15 minutes to go. And thank you for your patience, and thank you for not dropping us halfway. This is really a beautiful Pacific way where we let our speakers speak, we acknowledge, we appreciate, and we absorb all that great knowledge without rushing through the event. So I didn't play a very good timekeeping role, but my excuse is that all the speakers had such fantastic things to say. And also, Dr. Casule, your team at Greenpeace has played such a brilliant role in helping us pull this event together and bring all the guests to the table. So I didn't want to rush them. But with that, I have somebody very fantastic ending the session for us, which is we are honored to have Honorable Bikenibeu. Please bring him forward. And he is actually former Tuvalu Prime Minister who's been there for 3 terms before. And he was actually part of some of the very initial agreements that were signed on climate change. And he is representing Tuvalu Climate Action Network. And he will tell us what would a successful COP look like from Tuvalu's perspective. And we will end with that, because we can say COP was a failure or a success if we got this, and this checked off. So over to you, Honorable Penny.
Thank you, Ashwini, and my greetings to all of you and my friend and colleague, His Excellency, former President Anote, and now also Meg Taylor, hi to you. And of course, it was very nice to have listened to my colleagues in the panel. I think 29 years later, after the signing of the UNFCCC, which I was the first to sign it on behalf of Tuvalu, things have obviously changed now in the COP26. I was there on the first 10 COPs, I suppose so, and it wasn't the same. Now, of course, I think we have achieved some mileage since then, but still not enough for our purposes. Let me speak for what would we like to see from the COP26. And I suppose I thank you for having me to speak on that topic, because like Anote, we come from atoll nations. We are the first to have experienced, and indeed the magnitude of what we suffer, maybe not suffer, but I say suffer because of climate change, because of the nature of our atolls. I had been one of the prime ministers in those days to fight with the prime ministers of Australia, the president of Australia, of the United States, and many times with my colleague from Kiribati. Well, I like to see that I continue to live in Tuvalu from the outcome of this COP26. I like to see serious commitment. Yes, it has been global debating since day one in 1992, even up to now. But although I noticed there have been some serious pledges and commitments in terms of the finance, yes, please. We do need finance, and we need talking of billions of dollars. For instance, if Tuvalu is to continue to live in our land, we need the dike technology that the Netherlands, who's protecting its land, that most of it is 200 feet below sea level from the dike technology. And of course, I know that is expensive. Why can't we have it here in Tuvalu to protect us? We need that. And I think it's a responsibility for all those, in those days, they were called the Annex I countries, the industrialized countries. Of course, the terminologies we're now speaking in terms of climate change have changed up to now, because of course, from the Kyoto Protocol, then came the Paris Agreement. And of course, the IPCC that was established right from day one following the Second World Climate Change Conference on Climate Change, where I was speaking amongst 5 other heads of governments from the Northern Hemisphere. Then the IPCC was formed from then on, and still is. And I think it's excellent to have the scientists there to give us. So I like to see that. I like to see the finance, the financing for climate change to be less rigid. And I like to see too the money or the finance coming, the funds coming from these global climate change funds, to have most of it come to the islands, come to us, not through multilateral and organizations, I would say. Because from our experience, the $34 million that we received, which is now being used to constructing coastal, well, what do you call those, in 3 islands, most of that money was left, or rather within the UNDP system. Millions of it being spent on these studies, consultancies, salaries of personnel that don't live in Tuvalu but live out there in Suva, working from UNDP. I like to see most of that money coming to Tuvalu. I'm sure most of us have now got human resources that are certified accountants, economists, planners, even in the science field, climate experts, because we have groomed most of our citizens to go into those fields. If not, then let those technical expertise come and live in our countries, and let us spend the money directly to filter down to the grassroots. Well, it's sad to hear from Nicola how the Prime Minister of Australia was forced to go. Well, and it's sad because Australia sits in the forum, and here we see all these, like what I was saying, I fought with John Howard and many other Prime Minister of Australia in those days. And now this Morrison. I think Australia of all must be more Pacific heart and for us. So I like to see, in addition to those 2 issues, and a outcome from COP26 with greater resources pledged and serious commitment. And it's good, and I'm happy, and I'm very optimistic that UK is sharing it, because I know UK from day one had been a strong supporter of the UNFCCC, like all the rest of the other countries in Europe. And I know UK will do its best to make sure the COP26 will become human, or more human, and to actually help people like us. And again, I say atolls, because the magnitude of what we're going through and what we will end up through will not be the same with other countries that have higher lands, the volcanic countries. So I suppose for me, I've been away from this platform for a number of years because when I left government and I got involved in other stuff, I'm now back. I am with PICAN, and the government is using me a lot as well. I like to see this COP26 focus more on resilience in terms of food systems, on investing more on food. As you know, it is UN has completed a summit on food systems pathway, and I was the coordinator here from Tuvalu. We now developing, because it's amazing, because climate change had made Tuvalu left or not to cultivate our burrow pits, where we plant the pulaka. This is the giant swamp taro that grows in Rewa, Tavia, which is our staple food. Our ancestors dug all these pits down to about 10 meters below to get to the water level. Now the sea infiltration into these swamps, pulaka swamp pits, had made our people left this uncultivated. So we need to cultivate to have these food systems. I think is another issue I like to see, and respecting, of course, the rights of the indigenous people in our culture. Ashwini, I'll leave it there for now, and I know we'll continue to be together and fight. And when COP26 comes in, the voice of the civil society and, of course, the government will be heard by all those people and the leaders of the world. Thank you.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Honorable Kainiu, and Dhanyavad, and really humbled to hear your perspective from on the ground, you know, what's really happening, what are people experiencing day to day. So that was awesome. And also that invitation to say experts should come and live in the atoll islands to know what it's like, rather than sitting in our comfortable offices and trying to say, this is what climate change is. Let's go right there on the ground and experience climate change and know what it is to eat the same food for 5 days, because you cannot grow anything else. So anyway, just a comparison of our luxury and privileged positions that we come from, as opposed to what living on the forefront of the climate change impact is. And I'm really glad that His Excellency Edgar is here listening to everybody's positions, and I'm sure he would take some of these demands and requests and real life experiences to his government and ensure that these are embedded into the thinking of COP26. And even if we have almost 5 of our countries who are not able to attend COP, our voices, our demands, and all the different conditions in the Pacific would be taken into account when negotiating. To acknowledge actually all the CSOs, the various range of CSOs, like coming from DIVA, our colleagues there working on gender and climate change, and all the spectrum going down to Pacific Council of Churches. Like, we have a very wide range of civil societies present in the Pacific Islands and all the different nodes in Tuvalu, in Solomons, and in Papua New Guinea, sorry, not Papua New Guinea, but hopefully soon, right? and in the other nodes, and they have all endorsed these demands together. So it means that these Pacific Islands, let's say pacificdemands.org website, what it has is a collision of everybody's views. It's not one individual organization. It's what all the CSO society is bringing together to the COP. So that's very important to understand the difference in that. And also now I just want to see if there's any burning questions, any big clarification or something that people want to bring forward from the team before we end. Either from our participants, anything that hasn't been answered, that's really like a burning issue that we cannot but address right now. I guess we're doing well, right? We've covered so much ground today. Great. Well, then in that case, I would like to first just make sure we acknowledge and thank some of the great people behind the scene who have put the work into this press conference, not press conference, but the launch conference. And we would have something for the press on the side as well. And I hope if there is anyone joining from the press, will connect with us one-on-one separately and by email, so that we can answer any of your queries and questions as well, because we are not taking any of those right now. But on thank you, like the huge Vinaka Vakelevu goes to the team at Greenpeace Australia. So especially Sina, right? If you're there on your camera, we want to thank you, and we want to say Vinaka Vakelevu for supporting us and really holding the fort on this launch. And also generally, you have been very present in the Climate Justice Summit as well. So thank you so much. And also Langi, my Pacific Island Secretariat colleague who has been behind the scene. Langi, you can put your camera. And Christopher Butlett, who has been part of the drafting of the Pacific Islands demand. And really without these core people behind the scene helping out, we wouldn't get the final results, right? So thank you so much to all of you. And I also want to thank our interpreters for the sign language. Ednevad, Messi, Vinaka, you've done a great job bearing with us, even if we've gone over time. Thank you for your patience. And then I just want to also acknowledge people who are here. Let me see how many of you are here now. 71. That's not bad. Okay. I must say, hats off. Thank you so much, Dhanyavad, because really you've borne with us for like an hour and a half without dropping out. And that's really humbling. I'm really, really grateful that you've accompanied us for this launch, because without you, there is no launch, there is no huge conference. So thank you for bringing your energy, your time, and your beautiful smiling faces. I see some of you, and I see the names of some of you, and they look like familiar names and some new names. So I'm really humbled to see all of you here. And on behalf of the Pacific Island CAN, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And really, we are grateful that you have launched these demands with us. We will make sure that the world knows about this demand. And our speakers, let me go to you. So are they all here in line? All right, so there is Madam Nicola, Honorable Panu and Tong, Honorable Tong, Dr. Casule, Madam Taylor, and here we are, Madam Siale. Yes, thank you so much. Without you, we wouldn't have this launch as well. So thank you for bringing your amazing perspectives. Each one was different, very profound. And I'm sure give me some sign in the chat if people have learned something new today. Just like yes or no. Was there something new in what you've heard today from all these amazing speakers? I hope so. And I'd like to ask everybody we'll do some kind of different sign off and goodbye. I want everybody to go off their microphone, because really a launch without a hip hip hooray and a voice of everybody who's on the launch won't be complete. So please go off your mic. And I want to hear one word of celebration from people, and one word of like, let's go to the COP in warrior mode. So whatever you want to say in your own language, please.
Yeah.
Now at the count of three.
Yay! Yay!
Here we come.
Okay.
Fantastic. If we were in one room, we would do this together, right? Over some kava or maybe some non-alcoholic drinks. But here we are in this virtual room, and we do this together as well. Thank you very much. And a big hand to all of you for being here. Vinaka Vakalev.
Vinaka, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Climates also. I see you here. Thank you, Ollie and team, for all your support to the Climate Action Network. Modemanda, thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you to our speakers. Have a lovely dinner, and thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Thanks for your solidarity and the endorsement of the Pacific demands. Vinaka,
Good night.
Bye,
Siale.
Meg.
Okay. Bye, Dame Meg. Lovely to see you.
Beautiful. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Raijeli. Bye,
Oh,
Ashwin.
Thank you,
Yay,
Ashwini.
love you
Thank you
guys.
so much, everyone. Thank you,
Bye.
Raijeli. Thank you,
Thank you,
Siale.
Nilesh.
Bye, Sina.
Bye, Siale. Thank you so much. Man, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Sina. Who's there? So now do we have our PICAN team just
They're
coming on
still,
camera?
yeah, they're still here, so it should be good. Isa, Vinakatua sign language interpreter.
Isa, thank you guys. I'm sorry, I did not monitor time very well.
It's okay.
I thought somebody was doing the time check for me, but then I realized probably not. But guys, it's your dinner time, and I think I need a loo break too. So